The Canadian stock market represents about 4% of the world's stock markets. But many Canadian investors have significantly more weight in their portfolio in Canadian stocks. In fact, some investors only invest in Canadian stocks and have a 100% allocation to Canadian equities. Even if Canadian stocks only represented 50% of your portfolio, that's still very overweighted. This tendency to invest heavily in your own country's stocks is known as home bias. But Canadian investors could also have a country bias to the US, especially if you only hold a handful of stocks all from the US markets. Other investors may only have overweighted exposure to a handful of similar stocks from a particular sector, such as banks or high-growth stocks like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, known as the FANG stocks. These overweighted portfolios would have sector bias. This is another example of how diversification can be added to a portfolio to help produce better risk-adjusted returns. One of the reasons for various home or sector biases can be that investors don't know as much about other investments or markets and don't feel as comfortable picking individual investments in these areas. This is another good example of how you can round out a portfolio using different types of funds. For example, if you had a large Canadian home bias, you could look for an ETF or a few ETFs that give you broad equity exposure from around the world. Or you can use a fixed income mutual fund to balance out your equities with an allocation to fixed income. If you have a sector bias in the US, such as prevalent exposure to the large technology companies in the US, you could also look for a mutual fund or ETF that is broadly diversified in small or medium-sized companies in the US. For example, if we look at the BMO InvestorLine ETF screener, we can choose a category filter of US small mid-cap equity, or if we use an example of someone with only US stock exposure, they may want to use the fund screeners to look for Canadian and international funds to add to their portfolio in order to reduce the country bias to the US. And if you're wondering what a good global mix of country exposure would be, you could either use a portfolio fund to manage that for you, or look at the holdings in a portfolio fund to get a sense of how to build that out for yourself. Let's look at the BMO Asset Allocation ETF Z-Grow. If we look at the holdings of this portfolio ETF, we see there is exposure to the US at about 33%, Canadian equities are about 21%, the BMO MSCI EAFE Index ETF provides exposure to developed countries outside of North America and is almost 18%, and so on. We see there is exposure to some fixed income, emerging markets, and a small weighting to small and mid-sized US companies as well. Because this portfolio is professionally managed, using it and similar broad portfolio funds to help gauge what your overall portfolio might want to look like is not a bad idea. Of course, if you think you would rather have someone do this work for you, you could always just buy a portfolio fund and call it a day. It really depends on how much time and effort you want to put into managing your investments directly. Some people prefer to be more hands-on, and others want to delegate portfolio management to varying degrees.